Hi there, beautiful people. I'm Chris Jones. I'm presenting the Meet the Scientist channel for COP26.tv. And we're going to be speaking today to an incredibly experienced Professor John Whitelegg, who is a visiting professor from Built School, London John Moores University, and an associate of the German transport research organization Zentrum für Mobilitätskultur in Kassel in Germany. He's had a very varied set of projects working in India, China, Australia, Germany, Sweden, and Slovenia. And I'm really hoping to hear about some of those today, and also has worked with the European Parliament and the European Commission. He's also a board member of the Californian Organization for Transport Choices and Sustainable Communities. So really important person to talk to with regard to transport solutions and a whole range of different things. Welcome, John.
Hi, hello. Thank you for interviewing me.
So I'm going to kind of get stuck in as because there's so much to talk about. But what kind of inspired your area of research?
I think it goes back to the late 1970s when I was appointed, much to my surprise, to an academic post in the Department of Geography at Lancaster University, having before that been involved in very practical things. Before that, I was involved in running buses and ferries and organising transport in the Outer Hebrides, which was a very pleasant place to be, totally out of touch with anyone else on the planet. It was very pleasant. But when I started teaching transport, I decided I had to home in on what were the key things. And the key things which I found about at that time are still the key things now. Climate change, because that was well known in the 1970s. It's not particularly new, and the way in which we are trashing the planet and trashing ecology and ruining biodiversity and so on. Again, well known, but the amount of action, as we'll get on to deal with that, is quite minimal compared to the level of knowledge of what we do know is going on. And so I got involved in climate change and all the related things which seem to be missed out, that we don't do the linkage. Climate change is closely linked to things like sorting out air pollution and sorting out health, and importantly, sorting out social justice, which is actually a global thing. So, for example, we want everybody in any society on the planet, regardless of how much they earn or whether they're male or female or anything else or anything of that kind, to be able to move around, have accessibility, and not, for example, to be required to buy an electric vehicle that costs over £40,000, you know, high quality bus services, high quality cycle paths and so on. So the combination of public health, climate, environment and social justice seem to be very powerful. So I was lucky enough to start talking about that in the late 1970s with, at that time, I hope it's still the same, with large groups of people who then were 18 to 21 years old and very critical of everything I said. But that's a good way to get better at what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, that's a really good sort of set of principles to start talking about this, and you've done quite a lot of work in terms of your projects across the world in terms of sustainable transport. So yeah. would you tell me a bit more about what sustainable transport means to you?
Yeah, it's one of those phrases, two words I guess, which are often misused and misrepresented. So I try to be, well, when I do it, I try and tell people what it means. So sustainable transport means that what we have to do is organize our transport systems so that we're not actually crashing through any boundaries or thresholds that we should not crash through. Interestingly, this is well put by an organization I've also worked with for about 10 years, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and they've invented a fantastic concept called planetary boundaries. So basically they lay down sort of, if you like, red lines, things that we shouldn't cross. And one of the main things we're crossing is, of course, carbon emissions and climate change, but also it's biodiversity, and also it's a lot of other things which we don't have time to go into, to do with the ecology and the prospects of the planet surviving the damage that human beings do. So what sustainable transport means is, how do we organize transport so that we can all do what we have to do. We still need to gain access to things, and we still need to move about, and we still need to make sure our children are safe in a road traffic environment, and so on and so on. But how do we do it in a sensible way, talking to people, dealing with all the different demographics? What tends to happen with a lot of transport in Britain is that we look at it as if it's only men that are moving around, and we don't look at women. Or we look at it as if it's men aged 20 to 40 years old, and we don't look at children. So it's looking at all possible people moving around, and all the ways in which we can do that in ways that do not cross thresholds. So minimal carbon emissions, minimal air pollution, and interestingly, minimal demands on public expenditure, as long as we get a good result.
Okay, well, that's quite an interesting almost segue into one of the topics that that I'd like to talk about, which is sort of like mass transit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the I'm a science teacher, and one of the things that we're required in the curriculum to talk about is alternative solutions, non-individual transportation, things like trains and things like that. Now, how do trains around the world sort of do they meet that kind of sustainability requirement, or is there a sort of variation in how different train systems, for example, operate?
I think first of all with trains there's a lot of ostrich in the sand, or people not paying attention to sustainability principles. So we just usually we get on with running trains, and we don't think, could we do it in a different way? A couple of examples might help. I mean, where I live in a kind of a semi-rural part of England at the moment, Shropshire, all our trains are dirty, smelly, nasty diesel trains over 30 years old. They're very polluting. The diesel emissions damage human health, and they're uncomfortable, and they're overcrowded and so on. But no one in the train operating world that I have to use every week is paying attention to those things. If we then sort of leap around a bit, so for 3 years in my strange career, I was very lucky to be employed by a German transport ministry. I won't try and remember my German, it was always dreadful, but it was the Ministry of Urban Development, Housing and Traffic. And there we had lots of principles like all trains should be electric, no diesel. That's now changed a bit more, and all trains in Germany are guaranteed to be renewable electricity. No, the electricity must not come from oil or gas or nuclear, interestingly. So the Germans are getting that right. And the Swiss get it right as well, because what they're talking about is, which we don't understand at all in Britain, total integrated transport, so that all buses and all trains must operate in a way where they actually recognize the existence of each other. They kind of meet. And you can get off a train and you can walk across maybe 3-5 meters to find a bus. Now it might sound a bit nerdy and a bit simple and a bit basic kind of thing, but organizing a high quality integrated public transport system based on renewable energy is kind of the key thing. It's the holy grail, and trains don't do that.
Well, it's important if you jump off a train and then there's a bus that you've just missed, particularly where I am in Wales.
Yes.
You miss the bus, you've got to wait 2 hours.
The sad thing about, and this is why I think, and we might get onto this later, why I think in Britain we tend to deal with transport with so much hot air and so much empty rhetoric and so much broken promises. We don't actually organise a public, no bus service anywhere in any rural area in England or Wales or Scotland should have a frequency less than 1 hour. All buses should meet trains wherever that's possible. And here in Shropshire, we have several stations which haven't seen several train stations which haven't seen a bus since 1934. They just don't recognise the existence of each other. The reason I mentioned Switzerland is that they have actually put a lot of effort into building an integrated system, and they've invented something called pulse timetabling. Now, you don't need a PhD in science to understand pulse timetabling. It means something like 5 minutes every hour, wherever you are in a rural part of Switzerland, suddenly there's a burst of activity, and all the trains and all the buses meet each other, and then they all go off wherever they're going. And for 55 minutes, it's silent. But what pulse timetabling does is deal with the fact that people do actually move around using different modes of transport. They might cycle to a station, they might take a bus to a station, they might take a train and then a bus. And this, that's why the word integrated doesn't really get the amount of attention it should get. We could have, and we must have, a very, very high quality public transport system that attracts even dedicated car drivers. You know, that car drivers must be able to say, hey, hang on a minute, that's really, really good, isn't it? Mind you, I still love my car, and I still like playing country and music, country and western music, and I still like smoking, and I still like eating a hamburger when I'm driving, and therefore I won't use the bus, because there'll always be a proportion of people that are not going to move. You know, they're not going to change the way they travel, but the majority of people are quite reasonable, and they will actually move from the car trip to the bus train integrated trip, given the quality.
Yeah,